Good evening, everyone. I did make a promise that we'd start at exactly 6:33, so I'm going to keep it. Welcome, everyone. Again, we are so excited for you to join us on this incredible event. This event has taken a lot of planning, a lot of timing, and we are incredibly excited just to have you join us and sharing this very important conversation. Just before I introduce our incredible guests, I think it's just important to give credit to the people that organized this, to the incredible leadership that the South African Union of Jewish Students has, to all soldiers, to the incredible team that stand with us. Just a massive thank you to all of you and the incredible work that you guys do on a daily basis. And we look forward to you guys protecting our students across the world. Thank you. We're all very grateful to have two very special guests with us tonight, and this topic is incredibly important. We're discussing Zionism. Plain and simple, how do we reclaim this narrative? Because for years and years, many Jewish people and non-Jewish people across the world have felt that they have insufficient tools and knowledge, and even, being willing to reclaim this identity that has been so maligned for so many decades. And to help us unpack this, and to help us define Zionism, and to help us reclaim it, we have two very, very incredible and special guests. I'm going to start off with Ran. And Ran Bar-Yoshafat is a public diplomacy expert. He is a respected commentator on branches of government and their connections, and a leader of the Young Conservative Movement in Israel. Ran, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
And then below me on the screen, we have the incredible Dr. Einat Wilf, and she is the co-author of the famous book, The War of Return. And she is a leading thinker on matters of foreign policy, economics, education, Israel, and Zionism. It's a lot of things to be an expert in. She was a member of the Israeli parliament from 2010 to 2013, where she served as the chair of Education Committee and the member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Einat, Doctor, I should say rather, it is a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
And then just a few housekeeping rules before we get going. Everyone can see there is no chat enabled, but there is a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions straight to the panel, so only myself, Ran, and Dr. Einat will see them. No one else will, and it can be completely anonymous as well. So send through those questions, and we'll see at the end, we're going to get to answering a lot of them. Importantly as well, Dr. Wilf is incredibly busy. We're very lucky to have her, but she will be leaving at 7. So we're going to try to get as much expertise out of you before you leave, Doctor. Without further ado, we're going to begin, and keep in mind, I will interrupt. We're going to keep to a tight schedule and make sure we don't operate on Jewish time tonight. So without further ado, Dr. Wilf, how do you sort of define Zionism? What does it mean to you? What is your perspective? I'm going to give you just under 5 minutes to complete this question, and give us a bit of context so everyone else can understand.
So first of all, Zionism is not just what it means to me. Zionism is the political movement for self-determination, for liberation of the Jewish people in their ancient homeland. That's it. It's very simple, nothing much about it. For me, of course, it's a very instinctive identity. I grew up in Israel, taken almost Zionism for granted. But I'm very much aware that without Zionism, I could not be a proud Jew who walks with her head held up high anywhere in this world. And I think this was precisely the purpose of Zionism, to make sure that Jews know that someone has their back, that there is one place in the world where they have power, real power. Jews have been maligned for millennia for having imaginary power. Imaginary power Jews have always had. But real power is a fairly recent phenomena. State power is a recent phenomena. So the idea of Zionism, and also one that already Herzl wrote about, was not just that all Jews would have one state where they all live. He very much envisioned that once a substantial share of the Jews live in one state, all other Jews around the world will have the confidence knowing that they're not homeless, that someone has their back. And that's something that allows you to feel as an equal and to be confident among the nations. Now, the reason that Zionism has been maligned and this is not accidental, this is an intentional process, is precisely because we have civilizations that are still deeply uncomfortable with the idea of Jews having real power. In the historical view of certainly Western Christian and even Islamic civilization, the proper role of the Jew is powerless, is meek, is deferent. The fate of the Jew is in the hands of someone else. Zionism is about saying, you know what? We're done supplicating, asking for others to protect us, for others to defend us, for others to decide whether we live or die. Zionism is about self-determination. It's about the Jews determining for themselves their fate, defending themselves by themselves. And this is an idea, this is a concept that so undermines the role of the Jew in other civilizations that many forces within them instinctively mobilize to put the Jew back in the proper place of the Jew, meek and powerless. And that's why Zionism is maligned, because Zionism is about Jewish power, and many in the world want Jews to feel uncomfortable with Jewish power. And the first step is to make them uncomfortable about even using the adjective, using the label of saying, I'm a Jew and I'm a Zionist, which is why I insist on saying, I'm a Jew and I'm a Zionist.
And you've touched on so many of the different elements that we see in social media, whether it be statehood, self-determination, and there's a lot of different concepts that you're pulling together under that one banner of Zionism. And I'm going to go to Ran now to get your perspective on what Zionism means to you. How do you feel about a lot of the things that Einat has said? How do you identify with Zionism? It would be nice to hear your thoughts.
First of all, I obviously agree with her that there's a definition. Zionism is the realization of the idea of Jewish independence, sovereignty, and self-governing in their ancestral homeland, Israel. So I agree with her. It's a definition. Zionism, for me, is beyond the establishment of the state of Israel, which is the nation state of the Jewish people. It is an infinite idea. You know, we have Pesach just around the corner, and I think that from the time of Exodus, the people of Israel brought to the world two gifts. One is the gift of freedom. When the people of Israel left Egypt, we got freedom. And the second gift that we got was identity. And these are two interesting gifts to get at once. Natan Sharansky once said that in this world today, you have half that has a very strong sense of identity, but no freedom. And the other half is filled with freedom, but has a very loose identity. And I think that the Zionist idea succeeds in bringing the golden path that allows the individual and the collective to feel free yet belonging. And I think that this contribution to the world, the ability to walk between these two poles of identity, is a wonderful idea that Zionism brings to the world. And I don't think it is a chance that those who fight Israel today belong to the two extreme poles, both of whom are willing, in the name of their ideology, to destroy either individual liberties or to destroy national identity. And Zionism for me is my whole life. It's the meaning of my existence. It's my identity. It's my desires. It's my ideology, which is where I have my daily activity. This is what drives me. This movement that calls for Jewish to be sovereign over themselves in their country is what allows me for my existence, my family, my community, my people. I believe that Zionism is an ideological concept of which Jews and non-Jews should aspire, from right and from left. The freedom of the Jewish people proclaims the freedom of the world, in my mind. The ability to bring nationalism together with the idea of morality, liberty, and justice is the profound meaning of our being as a light unto the nation. And I think that Zionism represents everything that is right and just in this world. And I hope that with it, we will be able to repair all that is not yet repaired in the world.
So Ran, I mean, I think one of the most important things that you touched on there is that, right and left, it's about your identity, it's about your perspective, and you said, you said your life. And I think this is something, it leads in something to very important, is that there are so many different ways to see it. There's so many different ways to live it. And I think that people around the world, you can go to one Jewish table and all of a sudden you'll have so many different types of Zionism, so many different experiences. So often what happens is you have a right-wing Zionist, you have left-wing Zionists, and, we struggle to sometimes get along. People, we don't know how to reconcile the differences between different ideologies within Zionism. And Dr. Wilf, I'm going to just ask you to touch on, how do we reconcile this? How do you bring left-wing Zionists, right-wing Zionists, religious Zionists, the whole plethora of the selection of Zionists, and bring them together? What does that conversation look like to you?
In the Israeli Knesset.
Maybe in English, please, for everyone.
But it's the same idea. I have a talk that if people want, they can look after on YouTube, which is called, "What do we mean when we say that Israel is the Jewish state?" What is that concept? And I go through, it's a talk I typically give to non-Jewish audiences. And, I go through 4,000 years of Jewish mythology and history, and I bring them to the present. And then I tell them, after I've really confused them about all the kinds of Jewish identities and Zionist identities, I tell them that I'm going to give them the ultimate definition for a Jewish state. And the definition is that the Jewish state is the one state in the world where we get to argue about what it means to be the Jewish state. So in that sense, Zionism is very Jewish. In its essence, it harbors the idea of debate. By the way, as an aside, it's why Israel is such, by now, a long-standing democracy, because the argumentation over the essence of what it means to be a Jewish state, what it means to be what is Zionism, which is a Jewish state, is in the heart of our political system. It's in the heart of our society. I think the notion that we can determine it, that we can reconcile it once and for all, actually goes against the grain of Zionism, goes against the grain of Judaism. I think the heart of who we are is an ongoing argumentation about what it means to be the Jewish state. And what is the goal? What is the essence of Zionism? What are the values? How we live it? And I wasn't joking when I was saying in the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli Knesset is a forum where this debate happens all the time and where all the voices are represented. And you're right. I sat in the same parliament with people whose worldviews I detested, who I thought were destroying the country, who were taking Zionism and were going to destroy it. And yet, I accepted that I'm sitting with them in the same parliament of the Jewish state, and we are ultimately arguing not violently, but through voting, through legislation, through words. So for me, this is the essence of Zionism. We don't need to feel uncomfortable about the differences. We don't need to feel uncomfortable about the argumentation. Often foreigners come to Israel and they see Israelis yell at each other and then they go out for a drink. This is who we are. We yell at each other. We think the other person is going to destroy our country, and we continue living together.
Amazing. And you touched on something which I think is very powerful, in that it's not always about, who's right and who's wrong. It's about having that conversation to start with. And, I think that's something important which applies to many other debates that, people have in many areas of their life. But something which I think is quite sinister, though, in what you're saying, is that people are uncomfortable to talk about their Zionism. People are scared. People are afraid of both, regardless of which society you're in. And I think what's important is to discuss now why we're in that predicament. Why are we actually in a situation where, as a Jewish person, as a non-Jewish person, as a Zionist, you can't be proud of that element of your identity? And Ran, I just think, from your perspective, I know you've engaged with the youth, you've had a lot of engagement on campuses. How do you feel? Why are we in this situation? Why can we not be so, go out and proudly say, I am a Zionist for X, Y, and Z? Why are we in this predicament where we're scared?
I think that if you would take the average 15-year-old Israeli that lives in Netanya, and you'll ask him, who's your favorite rabbi? He'll say, I don't have a rabbi. And you'll ask him, who's your favorite Jewish philosopher? He'll say, I don't know any Jewish philosophers. And then you'll ask him, are you a proud Jew? And so, hey, yeah. And then you'll ask him, are you a proud Israeli? So, of course, I'm a proud Israeli. And I think that that is the victory of Zionism after the emancipation and the Enlightenment movement, when there was a debate of the Jewish identity, are you saving Judaism or are you saving Jews? I think that's the victory of Zionism, that for Israelis, this identity comes for free, and sometimes you don't even notice that it's there. I think that there's a big difference in how I understand my identity and how Jews who are not Israelis, and maybe there are a few exceptions in the world, but definitely North Americans, South Africans, Australians, and so on and so forth, when they say Jew, they think of a religion. But Judaism is also a culture, a tradition, and for me, first and foremost, a matter of nationality. And I think that this is a very sharp and important difference, because for me, Judaism is very particularistic. And for the Tikkun Olam students at UC Berkeley, their Jewish identity is universalistic. And I'm not saying that the two cannot go along, because I think that a lot of Israelis have universal values, and that's fine. But what is your core identity? And I think this is the conflict that people have. It's much easier to be a Jew in Israel, where if you are an observant Jew, if you're a religious Jew, it's very easy to be a religious Jew in Israel. And if you're a non-practicing Jew and you're an atheist, it's still very easy to be a Jew in Israel. And you know that your kids will not assimilate and you feel very comfortable, and like 99%, your kids will meet a nice Jewish girl and everything is going to be fine. So, and that's for free. I mean, taxes are going to that, but your identity is free. And I think that this is a very important difference, because if my identity is particularistic, and then someone who's a Jew in South Africa, Australia, UK, US says, well, what am I? Am I an American? Am I a Jew? How does that work? What if I don't believe in God? How does that work? What if I don't like gefilte fish? So these problems, I think that most Israelis don't really suffer from. And then there's a tension on how we understand the family, the Jewish people. I think that is the one of the key reasons for this this inner conflict in our identity.
Sure, and I think besides that deep inner conflict that you're talking about, I think a lot of people also suffer from overt fear. You know, people actually being scared of being hurt, being beaten up. You know, especially on many university campuses across the world. And I think sliding in the next thing is that when we talk about, we're in a time, a difficult time for students, Jewish students, non-Jewish students, Zionist students, I should say as well, across the world, during, you know, an IW, during Israel Awareness Week, if you call it like that, or Israel Apartheid Week, if you term it like that, where there is genuine fear among students. And I think having a discussion on Zionism and reclaiming it goes hand in hand with debunking the comparison made between the racist ideology that powered apartheid and the ideology that is Zionism. And I'm just going to touch on this very briefly, because I think it's important that our viewers understand the context of apartheid very briefly, albeit it's a very nuanced and complex discussion. But I'm just going to run through it very quickly before we build into the next question as well. So for everyone that doesn't know, the apartheid system was formally introduced in 1948 in South Africa, and to be the long and the short of it is that this was a system of domination, economic domination, perpetuated through the law, where separation, racial separation, occurred in every single part of everyday life. And this was done purely because of racism. This was done to maintain strict economic control between non-white groups and white. And this manifested, if you look 2-minute Google search on Google will show you very clearly that the legislation that was used to control it was something far, you know, it's scary. It's difficult to identify. We're talking about stuff where people of different racial groups could not marry, could not have relationships, could not walk on the same side of the street. You couldn't work in a certain area if you were not of an approved racial group. You could not vote at all. You know, your entire life was restricted purely because of the color of your skin. That was the be all and end all, and that was what controlled your destiny in this country. Thankfully, we are out of that system, which ended in 1994 with the first democratic elections in South Africa. And I just wanted to touch on, it's important to realize just how much of a system this was, where it's a legal system of domination purely based off race. I think that's the be-all. Again, it's a complicated this conversation, but just to give you some context. And the reason I'm talking about this is that Zionism is often compared to racism. It is compared to the ideology that I just mentioned, of what powered apartheid. And Dr. Wilf, I just wanted to ask you now, listening to what I'm saying, and obviously having knowledge of the BDS and other anti-Israel groups, anti-Zionist groups as well, you know, how do we use an analogy like this, Zionism and racism, apartheid and Israel? I'm sure everyone here has heard that for sure. Israel's an apartheid state. How, you know, why are we in that situation? Why do they use this sort of comparison? You know, what is the goals? What is the effects as well? Important. So I would love to hear insight before you have to leave us in 7 minutes.
So what you described is both, as you said, sinister and deliberate. It's not something that happened by coincidence. People who say that, they say, look, Israel is doing all these terrible things, and this is why, you know, Jews can't say they're Zionists. This is why Zionism has become associated with all these evils. To that, I always raise the question. I say, if Zionism became toxic because of what Israel did or does, then you would think that Zionism would actually retain its pristine image as an ideology of liberation and self-determination and equality, and the word Israel is the one that would be toxic. But what is happening is the opposite. It is Zionism that is the far more toxic word. Why? Because this was a decades-long deliberate process. You can actually view it from intellectuals, Arab and Muslim intellectuals in the 40s and 50s, going to the Soviet and Eastern intellectuals in the 60s, 70s. That's where it came to the United Nations, when the Soviet Union with decolonization had control. And ultimately, after the fall of the Soviet Union, to left-wing in Europe, academia, and today to the US. You can really chart both the timeline and the geography, but it's all very deliberate. And it works by a mechanism that I call the placard strategy. The placard strategy, you see it in every anti-Israel demonstration, is the placard that says on one side of the equation, Israel, Zionism, sometimes they just draw a Star of David, equals. And the placard strategy has been so effective that, like you said, we've never seen a placard that says Zionism equals the political movement for self-determination of the Jewish people and their ancestral homeland, right? That would be the correct, albeit long, placard. The strategy has been so effective that we all know what's on the other side of the equation. Racism, fascism, apartheid, colonialism, imperialism, for the advanced genocide, Nazism, and recently in the US, white supremacy. Now, why am I emphasizing recently? Because the placard strategy constantly changes with the times. And why does it change with the time? Zionism doesn't change. Because what changes is what humanity views as evil at every given moment. And right now, white supremacy is the evil du jour in North America. So suddenly everyone says Zionism is white supremacy. Apartheid for many decades was a great evil. So let's compare Zionism to apartheid. So the question is not what Zionism is like. None of these are the likenesses of Zionism. The question is, what represents evil so that we can create a global mindset in which people believe that Zionism is evil? That's all. That's how the strategy works. It works like a refrain, like music. Zionism, Israel, Star of David equal evil. Repeat it enough time, and this will be what people begin to believe. People will at least assume that, you know, where there's smoke, there's fire. It can't be that everyone says you're evil and you're not evil. And ultimately, like you said, Jews are pressured. They're a minority in most places. Why will they identify with something that people describe as evil? But like I said, this is deliberate. By saying that Israel, Zionism, Star of David is evil, you're creating a mindset that prepares the world for the eradication of this evil, right? Evil is not something you negotiate with. It's not about getting to peace. if someone ever tells you that, because you don't negotiate with evil, you don't divide land with evil, you conquer evil, you eradicate evil. So the idea is that this is an evil that should be eradicated. It's a very violent ideology. And why is it so violent? Because ultimately we go back to the root. The idea that Jews have real power, that Jews can walk this earth with someone having their back, that their fate is no longer at the hands of someone else, is anathema to civilizations that were predicated on the notion of Jewish powerlessness, on the idea that they supersede the Jews that came before, that Jews are a relic of history. Zionism is a bit like Schwarzenegger saying, I'm back, right? Zionism is about Jews saying we are not relegated to some nice relic of history. We are back in history. We are masters of our fate. We self-determine our future. You non-Jews will not tell us anymore if we live or die, mostly die. The moment that Jews teamed up to have real power through the state, through Zionism, what you saw was violent backlash through wars, through terrorism, in international bodies, and through this placard strategy, which, by the way, is not just on placards. Give anti-Israel people 30 seconds on TV. They will say racism, apartheid, genocide, no matter the question, because the idea is to implant in people's mind that this is the issue. And before I go, since I will not be able to comment any further, I will just end with a parting thought. A few years ago, I visited South Africa. I too believed in all the, rainbow post-apartheid nation, only to discover, as I'm sure you know, that the problems still run deep. And I think what happens with the adoption of the idea that by fighting Israel, you fight apartheid, is that a young generation of South Africans who basically are left with the hard work, right? Their parents, their grandparents had all the glory and pain of fighting a real apartheid. They are now left with the hard work of fighting poverty and inequality and questions of infrastructure and education. That's boring, that's hard, that takes time. Isn't it much easier to just transpose those emotions and fight apartheid that doesn't exist in some distant country? You still have the benefit of the emotion, the glory, but not really the pain. A colleague of mine called it a Disneyland of hate. I saw it in Northern Ireland. I think this is what's happening in America right now. People transpose their problems in their own countries to Israel, to Zionism. They get the emotional benefit of feeling as if they are fighters for justice, fighters against apartheid. But at the end of the day, they're not dealing with the real problems in their own country. We have our own problems. We will deal with them. I think it's best if people deal with their own problems rather than transpose whatever emotional issues they have to a faraway country where there's no apartheid. So I want to thank you. I will have to leave, and kudos to you for being brave, for reclaiming Zionism and not letting anyone tell you what kind of Jew you can be. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Wilf. It was a real pleasure to have you, and we hope to see you in South Africa again very, very, very soon.
I'd like
Thank you so much. Ran, I'm going to then jump to you now with the same question. Okay, and that is, given your experience and obviously your unique perspective, how do we actually deal with this comparison? It's easy, like Dr. Wilf was saying, there's placard strategy, there's a variety of ways that things are manipulated. But when hundreds of, well over 100 countries are saying this, when all the people around you are saying this, how do you deal with that? How do you stand up? How do you navigate that difficult situation of that comparison between Israel and an apartheid state, and also Zionism as racism, more importantly.
So before I give you a direct answer, and I just want to say I do agree completely with what Dr. Wilf was saying, but I want to give you a different angle here. I don't think it's a new concept at all. I don't think that being anti-Zionist is a new concept. The fact that now people are trying to label Zionism as racism, even though Judaism is not a race. You can say it's a religion, nationality, culture, tradition. It's not a race because you can convert into Judaism in the first generation, but whatever, trying to say that Zionism is discriminatory against non-Jews. I can give you all sorts of really interesting anecdotes of how, there are far-right Christians that they're trying to, pass these flyers that are anti-Israel, or radical Muslims who are trying to, create this notion that Israel is horrible. Or we have today the SJWs, the social justice warriors that want to be on the right side of history. So they're, fighting their cause, just like Einat was saying. And there's also a lot of ignorance. Like if people don't really know, but that's what they hear, then that's the perspective that they're going to have. But I think that it comes from something else, in my opinion. When you're asking how to fight it, I think we have to understand where it's coming from. And what do I mean by that? I'm going to put aside all of the psychological analysis of the human mind and all of that. I'm just talking about their work plan. And I think that the anti-Israel people have a better work plan. I do a lot of research regarding the UN. I wrote a policy paper about it. The UN is so biased against Israel, people have no idea. I'll give you just, two examples. One, there's a body in the UN that's supposed to deal with agriculture in Latin America. This body is getting money from the UN. The money for the UN is coming from people from all over the world. What that body did was conferences that are anti-Israel. And this is one example of hundreds of other stuff that are happening like that in the UN. Or when you go to visit the UN and you're asking for a tour, you're going to see the memorial for the Holocaust, and then you have to see, because it's not just that you have to, it's right there, but you also are obligated to see the Nakba. So basically, they're comparing the Holocaust to the independence of Israel. In the academia, I got a phone call a month ago from an American student. She's not a pro-Israel Christian. She's not Jewish. She was just interested, and someone directed her to me. And she said that her professor told her that Zionists came to the land of Israel because it had really great agriculture, and that's why colonialist European Jews came and took it from the Arabs. Israel was a desert, and this professor is not even anti-Israel. It's just a lot of ignorance that was spread through the academia, media, mainstream media. There was a terror attack in the Sawana coffee area in Tel Aviv a few years ago, and the first headline on BBC was 2 ultra-Orthodox Jews murdered people in a coffee shop near an army base. That is just they weren't ultra-Orthodox, obviously, right? There were 2 Arab terrorists coming from a town near Hebron. This is a distorted way of saying what has happened, and by the time that they changed the headline, it didn't matter. And I can give you a bazillion of examples like this. College campuses, social media, tourism, Netflix, TV shows, all of them are now trying to portray Israel as the bad guy. This causes a discourse. So I'm more interested not in the psychological analysis of why people hate us, if it's because of anti-Semitism or because of ignorance or because of religion. I'm like, they're just working really, really well. And I'm going to finish up with this because this is something that I've heard just yesterday. So now there's a new administration in the US, and obviously it's going to have a lot of, how should I put it? It's going to affect Israel tremendously. The Europeans are now about to give between 250 to 300 million dollars to different NGOs that are promoting peace. In this list of NGOs who are asking for the money, it goes between supporters of BDS, which I call not the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I called it the movement to destroy Israel because that's their aspiration. So it goes from this line to semi-terrorist groups. And let's just say that the Europeans who are giving out the money, they're not bad. They don't hate Israel. They might be naive, I don't know, but they just want to promote peace in the Middle East. That's the only group of NGOs that are there on the table. There are 5,000 NGOs who are working with the UN and with the EU just to get money, and they're not trying to build bridges. They're trying to vilify Israel. So that is why you have in South Africa, Israel is an apartheid. In other places, Israel is Nazi Germany. In other places, Israel is a colonialist. In other places, Israel is white supremacist, because they're working very, very smart, very well with a gigantic net. And I'm not saying that there's an office that is giving all of these directions. But first of all, there are major donors that you can find that are promoting this. And also, it's a trendy thing to do. It's like being a hipster. I know, it's something that's very, very trendy now. And they're working better. So I think that's the issue. How do you fight it? You need to fight better. You need to fight better. You need to see that the concept of intersectionality. I'm going to take one more minute because you didn't send me a time limit here.
Only 1 minute.
1 minute. I would argue that the concept of intersectionality is basically trying to, this whole struggle of good and bad. Okay, it used to be the rich versus the poor. Later it became men versus women, then white versus black, then, I don't know, straight versus gay. I'm not saying that there aren't issues with feminism, LGBTQ, racism. Of course, there are issues that people need to deal with. But what the anti-Israel movement did is that they took this concept of intersectionality. They took all of these struggles that have not really anything in common with Israel. If anything, Israel had, a female prime minister in the 70s. We're extremely pro-LGBTQ. We are the capital of veganism. Like, Israel is quite progressive, but they took all of these struggles and they were able to shift it towards Israel. Israel needs to do something of that sort to the other side.
So I'm gonna touch on that because you mentioned it a bit towards the end, is that, and I want to take it away from Israel for a second, because with a lot of Zionism, as you mentioned earlier, you talk about, being a nationality, talking about it being, Judaism obviously not just being a religion, ethnicity. And I think we have an issue, and this is obviously not something unique to South Africa. We have a situation across the world where the conversation shouldn't always be about Israel. When a lot of people, what happens is there's a separation between state on this hand and the ideology that perhaps led to the formation of it and the running of that state. And what people do is they split the two often. And I wanted to get your perspective on that. Can you talk Zionism without talking about the state of Israel? Can you separate the two? Because that is something which comes up very often in student discourse at a time like Israel Apartheid Week. That's something which is brought up all the time. And in, let's say, 3 minutes or so, do you think that split can be made between the state and that ideology?
I think it's an easy question. The answer is no. There are different streams to Zionism. The main two poles of Zionism are political Zionism and practical Zionism. Okay, political Zionism was Herzl, Jabotinsky, and their successors, and practical Zionism was Ben-Gurion. And you also have socialist Zionism, religious Zionism, spiritual Zionism, and so on and so forth. But the question was only, should people try to get the world to recognize Israel, to do it openly with confidence and with the approval, in a sense, of the international community, or you do it, step by step. You build another house, you make sure that there's another road here and another ranch there and another whatever. There were other movements while the Zionist movement grew in Europe and throughout the world. There was a territorial solution, said maybe Jews should live in Argentina. There were people who said Jews should not be with a state because that's some because of religious reasons, some because of other reasons. It doesn't matter. But to say that you can be a Zionist without Israel or that Israel can exist without Zionism, I disagree. The issue here is the name, okay? Because we have a lot of names. We're called Jews because we're the last tribe that was kicked out of the land of Israel, tribe of Judea. But we're also the people of Israel. So people are saying, wait, it's Israel, but it's the nation state of the Jewish people. How does it work? And what if we would have kept the name Palestine? What kind of a conflict would we have there? Because that was something that people considered. Prior to 1948, everything with the name Palestine referred to the Jews. So when Israel was reestablished, people said, should we call it Palestine? Should we call it Israel? Should we call it Judea? Eventually, they went with Israel because they said there are other tribes, not just the tribe of Judea, those who were kicked in First Temple, that want to come back here. So yeah, I don't think you can split the two.
Perfect. And just moving on to something that is important is that within our very own Jewish communities, often studying Zionism, understanding Zionism, the different types, as you mentioned, would be political, practical, religious, for all intents and purposes, takes some time. And those conversations, take effort. And often what happens is we don't have them. As Jews, we do not discuss Zionism enough. We do not understand it. We do not, critically analyze what this core element of our identity is. So I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what is the best way for Jews themselves, Jewish communities, whether it be in the diaspora, rather focus on diaspora as opposed to in Israel, how is the best way to deal with this within our own communities? How can we learn more within, our own Zionism? And this is going to be the last one before we go to our questions.
All right. So look, I'm currently writing my PhD dissertation on Zionism. Okay, I'm very fascinated with the topic. I don't think people need to have a PhD in Zionism to be able to have a debate. I once had a conversation with a guy from South Africa, actually, but it was in a conference in the US, and he was very, very critical of Israel. And I asked him, what happens if tomorrow Israel implements the Israeli law over Judea and Samaria? He said, well, I'll have a very, very hard time, continuing supporting Israel, and it'll be a very difficult thing for me to continue be a good Jew. And he said, all right, what if there's a peace deal? What if tomorrow there's another Arab state in Judea and Samaria, and that's it, the conflict is over? What else do you have in common with Israel? And he said, I never thought about it. So basically, for this person, his whole Jewish identity, because of his concept of trying to repair the world, was to criticize Israel, to make Israel this perfect state that he wanted to make us have, which is interesting because he didn't live here. But the point is that you have a lot of ways to connect to Israel. Some people can connect to Israel because their family lives there. Some people can connect to Israel because of the food. Some people can connect to Israel because of whatever, their religion. You choose. But how to learn how to debate it, there's so many different ways, and I don't think you need to have a PhD for that. I think that what you really need to do is to understand yourself. Because if I don't like it when people say, as a Jew, I must, no, as a human being with a critical mind, you need to understand that saying Israel and apartheid is just false. It's just a way to vilify Israel. And you don't need a PhD for that. I'll be blunt. I think that the South African Jewish community is a struggling Jewish community for many reasons. I think it's a unique Jewish community in the world. So I think that for you guys, it might be a little bit more difficult for many reasons. But you choose. It's your path. I do recommend strongly that people will find out for themselves what their identity is. Why should they care for Israel? You mentioned that it's very hard for you guys to be students. I respect it. I agree with you. I think it's very, very hard. I have to tell you that when I go to college campuses, it's funny for me when people are trying to protest against me. Because I deal in Israel with Hamas and Hezbollah and terrorists, and then I go to a college campus and this guy's shouting at me like, okay, he's touring my conflict. And now he feels like he has the moral high ground because he's supporting the underdog. And anyway, to wrap it up, it's up to you. You choose how you want to study and how you want to do it. There's so many ways. You don't need a PhD dissertation for it.
Perfect. I'm going to go to our questions then now, just before you as well have to leave. But I think we've got an interesting question, which basically talks about why are Jewish students quicker to criticize Israel than stand up for it? Do you think Jewish students are not educated enough on Israel and Zionism? And how do we deal with this? So in about a minute, how would you respond to something like that?
The answer is yes, they're not educated enough, but also Israelis are not educated enough. Look, if I'll ask the average Israeli, I'll ask him, can you tell me a little bit about Zev Jabotinsky? I'm not sure that he'll be able to give me an answer. He'll know who Ben Gurion was, but he's not going to. I don't think that's the case because he's going to be a proud Jew. Most Israelis, you have a lot of criticism against Israel from Israelis, and you have radical left in Israel as well, and so on and so forth, and you have anti-Israel Israelis. But average Israeli is very pro-Israel. The vast majority from the right and from the left are very pro-Israel. And I don't think it's just knowledge. I support knowledge. I think knowledge is important. I think it's super crucial, but not just to be an Israel advocate on college campus, but for any Jewish person in the world to have a sense of identity. Just like I think if someone is, I don't know, has any different background, they should learn about their identity. Doesn't mean that you have to be separate, doesn't mean you cannot connect to other people, but you should know who you are.
Is there, I'm gonna ask, is there any area of Jewish identity outside of Zionism? Can you be a proud Jew without being Zionist?
Yes, of course, you can be a proud Jew and not be a Zionist. I just think that it won't last for the long run. Meaning, we have a song in Hebrew. I'm going to try to translate it into English as fast as I can in my mind.
You're going to sing it. I thought you were going to sing it.
2 Memorials Day we have 1 week apart. So just to figure out how much it costs to be with Israel and how much it costs to be without. I think I did a pretty good job. So IDF Memorials Day is Memorials Day for the 23,000 fallen IDF soldiers and victims of terror. And the other Memorials Day is the Holocaust Memorials Day for 6 million Jews. For me, that says a lot. I think the message I hope was sent here.
So, and then just another question that's come up. Do you think young Jews, and this is more specifically diaspora Jews, are losing their connection to Israel and the youth? And why do you think, whatever your perspective is on that?
Absolutely, yes. I think that the youth are getting less connected. Well, because they don't know what it's like to be without. We're suffering this year from COVID. And right now in Israel, when a lot of people are vaccinated, now they've opened the country again. People are so excited to go to a coffee shop. How much excitement did they have before that to go to a coffee shop? Not that much, but once you lose it, it's different. If Jews think that if they're going to be anti-Israel, they're going to be liked, I think they're wrong. People don't like you because you're a Jew. They're not going to like you even if you convert to Christianity, even if you become vegan. I see this in America. It's very common that Jews want to jump on the bandwagon, and the left is, in my opinion, going more and more to the left. And in the pyramid of political correctness and identity politics, Jews are white. Now, I don't think Jews are white. Actually, I would argue Jews are definitely not white. You have Jews of all colors, and I don't consider myself white. But the way that most Americans see Jews is as whites. And I think that's the same for South Africans. I don't think people say, well, Jews are a unique minority group. No, they're saying Jews are whites. So I think that's one of the reasons. You don't want to be the bottom of the food chain, and you want to be on the right side of history. So it's not cool to be a patriot that supports Israel, which is particularistic and not universalistic, and you're not joining the struggle. So yeah, I think the younger generation doesn't know what it was without Israel, cannot really imagine what it would be like when they won't have a country to back them up.
Yeah.
And that's yeah, I think that's one of the reasons.
And do you think, you touched on this earlier, this is another question that's come through. You mentioned about not being at the bottom of the food chain. Do you think a lot of Jewish people often actually become or choose to be anti-Zionist to fit in with broader societal opinion around them? Do you think that's also happening?
Yes, but I don't think that that's what they think. I think that what they think is that they're on the right side of history. They're saying, look, for them, their Jewish identity is Jewish values. I don't believe in the concept of these Jewish values. When you ask in the Pew Research Survey, what does it mean to be Jewish to you? To be a good person. Like, that is racist. I mean, not racist, but discriminatory. Can you not be a good Christian and a good Muslim and a good atheist and a good vegan? To be a Jew, in my opinion, is to be a part of the Jewish people. You can be observant, you cannot be observant, but it means something that's deeper than just to be a good person. Do you think Jews need to be good people? Of course. But I also think Christians should be good people and Muslims should be good people, and I think they are. So, but people who grew up in this concept of tikkun olam, I once had an American Jewish student, she came up to me and she said, how do you say tikkun olam in Hebrew? That's her Jewish identity. And for her to be a Jew is to volunteer with the poor. I'm pro-volunteering with the poor. I'm just saying it's a human thing, not a Jewish thing. So for them to combat, in a sense, this notion of Israel, which is different in her area, she thinks it's not coming because she wants to fit in. She thinks that she's doing the right thing because she wants to be on the right side of history.
And then going forward in terms of how to actually reclaim a narrative, how to be proud, how to be brave if it comes to that. If you had to give someone one tip on how to actually do that in a practical sense, not going and reading Herzl's memoirs, or something, how do you make this simple to encourage young Jews and non-Jews, anyone who identifies as Zionist, to reclaim that narrative? One tip.
So just one thing, I don't like the word narrative. I believe in history. So, and I don't like people saying be on the right side of history. There is history. I don't think, again, you need a PhD dissertation. Israel 101, just to know what Israel is it would be a very short booklet. Okay, it will take the average Jew to understand the basics of their identity, a few hours. It's the Jewish education that's coming from the parents, from the friends, from the family, from the community, that's the way to support each other. Meaning you need to find people who will join the struggle and they will work with you. That is the way that you can move forward. That is the way you can hold your head up high. And I think that the fact that right now there is a state for Jewish people, that's a very good reason to raise your head up high, because if something happens, you have a state that can help you. I'm not saying Israel is the world's superpower, but without Israel, it would be more difficult.
And then can I ask, because you touched on this, and this is actually a topic that comes up very often in debate and discourse, is that, and I'll like say why I use the word narrative, is that often people will say that if you can't have empathy or sympathy for another perspective and without denying your own. You cannot believe in you cannot believe in Israelis or Jews having the right to a state and simultaneously have empathy for Palestinians or anything like that. So in terms of, from a Zionist perspective, is that possible? Is it possible to believe that, with empathy for both people? Because you mentioned you believe in history. So how do you balance the two?
You open up a big can here. I disagree on several levels. First of all, I don't think you always need to have sympathy. I don't think that people need to say, I don't know if you know, but more Nazis were killed in the Second World War than the Allies, and I think we should, no, that's not how it works. I don't think that there should be a memorial for the Japanese who committed the kamikaze to Pearl Harbor. And I have nothing against Germans today or against the Japanese, but I'm just saying, I don't think that you should have empathy and sympathy for everyone. But let's say that you want to have. Of course, you can have empathy and sympathy for human beings. You should, and you should be able to say, if you have a strong backbone, you can say, this is what happened. I feel bad for you, but this is the reality. Let's see how we can live better, how we can have a better future for you, for me, for the next generation. You can be very empathetic and sympathetic, and I think that it's important to have sympathy and empathy. But I don't think it needs to be in the sense that I'm changing reality or changing facts. Okay, I'm sure people here have heard of Ben Shapiro that keeps saying facts don't care about feelings. I think is correct. I think we should care about feelings just to have respect for the people that are speaking with us. But then I go back after I'm respecting the person and I'm having empathy and sympathy, I'm saying, but we still have the facts. I cannot change history just so the other side will feel better.
And another question that has come up now is talking about, and this is something a bit more technical and from a legal perspective, just to touch on this because this is important, in terms of areas A and C, in the West Bank. This is something which will come up, I'm sure, a bit of a, how do you deal with the claims of segregation, of people saying these two areas are split along racial lines, similar to apartheid? How do you deal with an accusation such as that?
For me, it's funny because the people are saying that they don't understand that basically they just joined the far right wing in Israel, which is where I stand. But if people say a Jew in Tel Aviv and an Arab in Ramallah don't have the same rights, they are correct. But a Jew in Tel Aviv and an Arab in Tel Aviv have the same rights. An Arab in Ramallah doesn't have the same rights as a Jew in Tel Aviv because the Israeli law is not implemented over Judea and Samaria. in Ramallah. So if they wanted to have the same rights, great. You're just saying you want greater Israel. Okay. I don't have the same rights as you who is now in South Africa. Why? Because I'm not a South African. So if they're saying it's not fair that you have two different legal systems, like, okay, so let's implement the Israeli law and have everyone under the Israeli law. In Israel, you have Jews and Arabs, Israel proper. You have Jews and Arabs living with full equal rights. I'll just give, just name a few examples. The Arab Supreme Court judge who sent the Jewish president to jail, high-ranking officials who are Arabs, Muslims, Christians in the IDF. The third biggest party in the Israeli parliament is the Arab Party, and you have Arabs who are in other parties, doctors, lawyers. These are Israeli citizens. Those who are not Israeli citizens, because either they're under a terrorist regime, a theocratical terrorist regime in Gaza, or under a terrorist secular organization, the PLO, they're saying that they don't have the same right. All right, so let's all be under Israel. Jews don't have the rights in Judea and Samaria. This really, for me, it's like, have you been there? There are segregated roads. The Jews cannot enter. There are segregated buses. The Jews cannot enter. In Israel, you don't have that. Only under the PA and under Hamas, you have that segregation. How many Jews live in Gaza? So yeah, but just to clarify for those who are listening, A, B, and C. A means that the PA has control for security and municipality. B means that they have control for the security for municipality and Israel for the security. And C means that Israel has control over the security and the municipality. The Israeli law is not implemented in Judea and Samaria. I am very hawkish. I would love it to be implemented, but then you dismantle the concept of Arab nationality in Judea and Samaria.
And then just to end off, because we are running out of time, just as one last thing, if you could give advice to people on how to be Zionists, how to explore Zionism, what would it be? Because that is what we're here to do. Essentially tonight is about reclaiming the idea of Zionism.
To be a Zionist is not to be a racist. I know that this is not what you're hearing, but if you think about it again, the concept that Jews also have a right, just like any other people in the world, to govern themselves. That is a definition. What is unique to the Jewish people, unlike all other nations, is that we were actually here 2,000 years ago. All of the academic tools that the Europeans came up with in the 19th century to determine what is a nationality, common solidarity, history, religion, tradition, culture, and so on and so forth, language, territory, we had it. We're like one of the perfect models in the world for a nation state. So I'm trying to understand, people are saying, I'm not anti-Jews, I just don't want Jews to have a state. Why? And you can divide it into two people. People who are just, I'm sorry, plain anti-Semitic, and people who are against nationality all over the world. And for those who are against nationality all over the world, I'm like, well, why are you starting with me? Like, why did you choose to start with Israel? So how do you become a proud Zionist? If you're a Jew or non-Jew, just stop being racist. Former professor of law and former, Minister of Justice and professor of law, Irvin Kotler said in Canada, he said that the anti-Israel movement is trying to make Israel the Jew among the nations, right? Like, you should not exist. You need to, everyone's like bullying Israel. What is that? If you're saying that Jews don't have the same political rights as any other group in the world, you're a racist, or it's not really race, but you're discriminating Jews. How do you become a Zionist? Stop being so discriminatory.
Thank you, Ran Bar-Yoshafat. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. And just to end off, thank you everyone again. Thank you to Soldiers for the incredible student leadership that really do protect and advocate for Jewish students on campuses across South Africa to stand with us. Thank you so much for the incredible things that you guys do every single day. And to all of you who could tune in, thank you so much for being here, for giving up of your time on a Thursday night, or wherever you're attending, could even be in the afternoon. Thank you so much for attending. We look forward to spending the next webinar with you, and just stay safe and good night. Thank you, everyone. It's been an absolute honor. Cheers.